In November 2009, five emaciated young women were discovered in the hidden basement of a home in Ashland, Pennsylvania, exposing a nightmare that had been unfolding in silence. An investigation revealed the dark and twisted world of Jacob R. Miller, a neo-Nazi leader who had kidnapped and imprisoned them in his pursuit of a pure lineage. The horror began in June 2008, when 19-year-old Samantha Baker disappeared while walking home from her job in a nearby diner. Over the next year, 4 more young women would vanish, each taken by Jacob to fulfill his depraved vision. What followed was a year of unimaginable suffering that would culminate in an escape that shocked the nation and brought Jacob's horrific crimes to light. To the people of Ashland, Pennsylvania, Jacob R. Miller seemed like the kind of man who made the world feel safe. His house, nestled at the end of Maplewood Avenue, was a picture of order, its white picket fence standing straight and clean, the lawn always meticulously trimmed. For more than a decade, Jacob lived quietly among his neighbors, making small talk at the grocery store and handing out candy to kids on Halloween. He was the first to donate to local charities and could often be seen sitting in the front pew of St. Mary's Church on Sundays, his head bowed in reverence. People whispered that Jacob was a good man, a man who took care of his community, but no one ever whispered about what might be hidden behind his front door. Jacob owned a small printing business on Main Street, a modest operation that specialized in pamphlets, posters, and newsletters. Local businesses praised his work, describing it as clean, professional, and always delivered on time. Behind the scenes, however, the printing shop served a far darker purpose. While Jacob printed birthday invitations and business cards during the day, by night, the machines churned out propaganda for the Iron Dawn Alliance, a neo-Nazi militia that Jacob led with quiet but chilling devotion. The materials were filled with hate, calls for the rise of a pure race, warnings of a world being corrupted, and instructions for recruitment. These pamphlets were sent out under the cover of darkness, mailed to anonymous supporters or left in small stacks at truck stops along the highway. It was a network built on secrecy and paranoia, and Jacob, with his meticulous nature, was its architect. Jacob had always been a man of routine. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., he would step onto his porch, take a deep breath of the cool Pennsylvania air, and water the flowers hanging from the eaves. At 7 a.m., he would be in his shop, opening the doors to customers who greeted him warmly. He was predictable, steady, and utterly unremarkable. His unassuming nature was his greatest camouflage. Even those who suspected his involvement with far-right groups dismissed it as just talk, harmless, and more about posturing than action. After all, Jacob smiled at everyone, regardless of their background, and sponsored the local Little League team for 5 years. How could someone so kind do something so wrong? But kindness can be a mask, and Jacob's was stitched tightly to his face. His church-going habits and community generosity were tools to deflect suspicion. At St. Mary's, people admired how Jacob always stayed after Mass, chatting with the elderly or helping stack chairs. He spoke softly, never raised his voice, and always asked if there was anything he could do to help. For the priests, Jacob was a godsend, a man willing to donate not only money, but also his time. In June 2007, when the church roof needed repairs, Jacob offered to print a series of flyers to raise funds, free of charge. He even handed out the flyers himself, door to door, shaking hands and smiling as he went. No one could have known that this same man spent his evenings surrounded by blueprints for terror. Beneath his well-mannered demeanor was a mind warped by ideology, one that viewed his neighbors, his church, and even his friends as pawns in a larger game. To Jacob, everything he did was in service of his twisted mission to create what he called a new dawn for mankind. Jacob's beliefs had roots that stretched back decades. As a teenager in the late 1980s, he fell in with a group of older men who shared pamphlets about the purity of certain bloodlines and the decay of modern society. They taught him that the world needed leaders who were willing to act, men who wouldn't be afraid to get their hands dirty for the greater good. Over time, these ideas became the foundation of Jacob's life. By the time he reached his early 30s, he had turned those ideas into action, founding the Iron Dawn Alliance in 2002. The group started small, just Jacob and 3 other men meeting in basements and garages, drinking beer as they spoke of a better future. But Jacob's meticulous nature turned their ramblings into strategy. He drafted rules, designed logos, and gave speeches that inspired his followers to recruit others. By 2005, the group had grown to over 50 members, most of them scattered across rural Pennsylvania. They trusted Jacob completely, seeing him as a father figure, a man with a plan. But Jacob's ultimate plan was something he shared with no one. It started subtly. Jacob would talk about the need for action, about how words weren't enough. He hinted at legacy and purity in ways that made even his most loyal followers uncomfortable. Behind the scenes, Jacob began preparing for something far more sinister. In early 2006, he converted the basement of his home into what he described as a fortress. He installed heavy steel doors, soundproofing, and locks on the inside of the walls. To any outsider, it looked like Jacob was simply a man concerned about safety. To Jacob, it was the beginning of his breeding experiment. Jacob believed that creating a pure race couldn't be left to chance. He didn't trust the world to get it right. Instead, he would do it himself. It was this belief that drove him to carefully select his victims, young women he deemed genetically superior, but easy to manipulate or overpower. He spent months studying each one, learning their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. And when the time came, he struck with the precision of a man who had been planning it for years. By mid-2008, the basement was ready, and so was Jacob. He had transformed himself from a man who smiled at strangers into a predator who could blend in perfectly with the world he despised. His ability to walk among the people of Ashland without raising suspicion was his greatest strength. But it was also what made him so dangerous. On the surface, Jacob R. Miller was the perfect citizen. Underneath, he was a man preparing to tear lives apart, all in the name of a warped vision of purity. September 15th, 2009, would reveal the truth to the world, but by then, the damage had already been done. The 5 young women, each torn from their own lives and dreams, entered Jacob R. Miller's basement at different times. The cold, dark dungeon would strip them of their individuality at first, turning them into frightened, nameless captives. But in the months and years that followed, their shared torment forged a bond that no one, not even Jacob, could break. They became more than victims. They became survivors, sisters bound by suffering and resilience. Samantha Baker, known as Sam, was the first to be taken. In June of 2008, she had been walking home late one evening from her part-time job at a diner when Jacob's truck pulled up beside her. He offered her a ride, and though she hesitated, his calm demeanor and polite tone lowered her guard. She never made it home that night. The last thing she remembered was the sting of a needle in her neck before everything went black. When she woke up, she was chained to a wall in a concrete room with no windows. For weeks, she screamed until her voice gave out, banging on the walls until her knuckles bled. Jacob would watch her silently from the doorway, his expression emotionless, as if her suffering was merely a necessary part of some greater plan. Sam was fiery by nature. Even as fear consumed her, she never stopped thinking of escape. She noticed everything: how long Jacob stayed each time he entered, which locks he used, and even how his boots sounded as they moved across the floor. She channeled her rage into quiet resistance, vowing that if she couldn't escape, she would at least make his life as difficult as possible. Over time, she became the glue that held the others together, her strength a beacon in the darkness. Emily Carter arrived in September 2008, 3 months after Sam. She was quiet and shy, a young woman who had spent most of her life blending into the background. She had been kidnapped while walking her dog in the early hours of the morning. Jacob's planning was precise. He waited until Emily reached a stretch of the park hidden by trees, where no one would hear her scream. Her dog ran off as Jacob overpowered her, dragging her into his truck. In the basement, Emily was paralyzed by fear. She barely spoke for weeks, retreating into herself. But Emily had a sharp mind, and while her body was chained, her thoughts roamed free. She began to notice patterns: how Jacob's mood changed depending on the day, how he adjusted the chains differently depending on which girl he interacted with, and how he would sometimes mutter under his breath. She remembered everything, cataloging his routines like a mental ledger. Her observations would later become crucial to their survival. Ava Thompson came next, taken in January 2009. Ava was nurturing by nature, the kind of person who could calm a crying child or soothe a friend's broken heart. She was the oldest of the group, having just turned 20 when Jacob lured her into his trap. She had been waiting for a bus when he approached her, pretending to be a stranded motorist in need of help. Ava's kindness was her undoing. She offered to let him use her phone, and as she fumbled with her bag, he struck. From the moment she was thrown into the basement, Ava became the caretaker. She held the others when they cried, comforted them after Jacob's punishments, and shared whatever scraps of food she could spare. Her pregnancy, the result of Jacob's twisted plans, became both a source of despair and determination. Though the weight of her growing belly made her movements slow and painful, she refused to let it weaken her spirit. She often whispered to her unborn child, promising a life far away from the horrors of the basement. Rachel Miller, Jacob's niece, was the only one who knew him before the captivity. She had grown up visiting his home for family gatherings, sitting at his table during Thanksgiving dinners, and listening to him tell stories about their ancestors. When Rachel was 15, her parents had sent her to stay with Jacob for the summer. He had always been strict, but never unkind. She trusted him, even admired his discipline. That trust was shattered one night in July 2007 when he drugged her and took her to the basement. Jacob claimed he was protecting her from a corrupt world, that she was special and chosen. At first, she believed him, but the reality of her captivity soon broke through his lies. Rachel's knowledge of Jacob's life became both a curse and a weapon. She understood his routines better than anyone and could anticipate his moods, but her connection to him also made her feel responsible, as if she should have seen the monster lurking beneath his kind uncle facade. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but it also fueled her resolve to bring him down. Lily Harper was the last to be taken, kidnapped in April 2009. Sweet and delicate, Lily was a dreamer who believed in the goodness of people. She had been walking home from a poetry reading at her local library when Jacob snatched her. In the basement, her fragility became both a blessing and a curse. The others rallied around her, protecting her like a younger sister. But the harsh conditions quickly took their toll on her body and spirit. The basement itself was a nightmare. The walls were unpainted concrete, stained with mildew and streaked with rust from the pipes overhead. The air was damp and thick, carrying the sour stench of unwashed bodies and rotting food. A single bucket in the corner served as a toilet, its contents emptied only sporadically by Jacob. Chains hung from the walls, cold and heavy, leaving red, raw marks on the women's wrists and ankles. The only light came from a single dim bulb that flickered unpredictably, plunging them into darkness without warning. Jacob ruled the basement like a god, his every whim shaping their existence. He controlled their food, sometimes bringing small portions of stale bread and watery soup, other times withholding meals entirely to punish them. He would speak to them with a chilling calmness, explaining that they were part of something greater, his chosen vessels. When they cried or resisted, he would remind them that they were alive because of his mercy. Punishments were brutal. Jacob would leave them chained in silence for days, turn off the light to plunge them into total darkness, or force the others to watch as he harmed one of them. He took pleasure in their suffering, not just physically, but emotionally. He played cruel games, pretending to unlock the chains only to laugh as he tightened them again. He manipulated their fears, making them believe that the outside world had forgotten them, that no one would ever come to save them. Despite everything, the women clung to each other. They shared whispered hopes in the darkness, held each other after Jacob's visits, and found small ways to rebel. Sam would quietly loosen the bolts on her chain when Jacob wasn't looking. Ava would hum lullabies to calm their nerves. Emily would share her observations, planting seeds of hope that one day they could use his own patterns against him. Even Lily, frail and fading, would speak of the life she dreamed of beyond the basement, a life filled with sunlight and freedom. Jacob believed he had broken them, but he underestimated their strength. The basement may have been his prison, but it became their crucible, forging a bond stronger than anything he could tear apart. They were no longer strangers. They were sisters, united by their suffering and their shared dream of escape. On November 3, 2009, a bitter cold settled into the basement where the women were held captive. The damp air clung to their skin as they huddled together for warmth, whispering quiet reassurances to each other. For weeks, Lily Harper had been growing weaker. Her pregnancy, already taxing on her frail body, had become unbearable. Her once hopeful demeanor had been replaced by exhaustion, her strength sapped by the endless days of captivity. That morning, the first sharp pain hit, and it became clear she was going into labor. At first, the women didn't know what to do. They had no medical training, no supplies, and no way to summon help. The single flickering bulb in the basement cast long shadows as Lily writhed on the thin mattress in the corner. Her cries soon became screams, raw and unending, filling the suffocating space. Ava Thompson, who had become the group's caretaker, knelt by Lily's side, her hands trembling as she tried to calm her. Emily Carter, ever observant, scanned the room for anything they could use. A scrap of fabric, a piece of metal. But there was nothing. Rachel Miller, Jacob's niece, pressed herself against the wall, her face pale as she struggled to hold back tears. They screamed for Jacob, their voices echoing through the small vent in the ceiling. When he finally appeared at the top of the stairs, the sight of his towering figure filled the women with equal parts dread and desperation. Sam Baker stepped forward, her body tense, as she demanded he take Lily to a hospital. Ava begged him, her voice cracking with emotion. But Jacob's expression was cold and indifferent. He dismissed their pleas with a chilling finality, claiming that nature decides who's worthy. Without another word, he turned and left, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. The hours dragged on, each one more agonizing than the last. Lily's screams grew weaker as her energy drained. Ava stayed by her side, wiping the sweat from her brow with a torn scrap of fabric, whispering soft reassurances that she herself didn't believe. Emily held Lily's hand, her small frame shaking with silent sobs as she tried to offer what little comfort she could. Sam paced the room, her fists clenched, her rage barely contained. Rachel sat in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the cracks in the floor as if they might swallow her whole. By the time night fell, Lily's body was failing her. The child was born in the early hours of November 4th, 2009, a tiny girl with dark hair and a faint cry that somehow pierced the heavy silence. Ava held the baby in her arms, rocking her gently as Lily lay motionless on the mattress. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes unfocused. She didn't have the strength to hold her child, to even speak. As the hours passed, her breathing slowed until finally, it stopped altogether. Lily Harper was gone. For a moment, the basement was utterly silent, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then the grief hit all at once. Ava let out a broken sob, clutching the baby to her chest as tears streamed down her face. Emily collapsed to the floor, her body racked with trembling. Sam punched the wall with a ferocity that left her knuckles bleeding, her anger boiling over into raw, physical pain. Rachel curled into a ball, her shoulders shaking as she wept into her hands. But amid the grief, a shift occurred. Lily's death was more than a tragedy. It was a breaking point. As the women sat in the dim light, their faces streaked with tears, they realized that they could no longer endure this nightmare. They could not let Lily's death be in vain. They had to act. In the days following Lily's death, the women began to plan. Sam, fueled by a mix of rage and determination, took the lead. She spent hours examining their chains, testing the strength of the bolts that held them to the walls. She found a shard of metal that had broken off one of the rusted hinges and began practicing how to pick the locks. Her fingers bled from the effort, but she refused to give up. Emily, who had always been observant, started paying even closer attention to Jacob's movements. She noticed how his reliance on alcohol was making him careless. On November 6th, 2009, she saw him stumble down the stairs, his gait uneven, the smell of whiskey clinging to his clothes. That night, he forgot to lock the main door to the basement. Emily noted every detail, storing it away for the right moment. Ava focused on keeping Lily's baby calm. The infant's cries were soft but sharp, a sound that could easily draw Jacob's wrath. Ava rocked her endlessly, whispering lullabies and cradling her with a tenderness that defied the darkness of their situation. Rachel, though still haunted by guilt, began to share what she knew about Jacob's routines and habits, giving the group valuable insights into their captor. By November 8th, 2009, the plan was ready. Sam had managed to loosen the bolts on her chain, giving her enough freedom to move. The women waited for the right moment, when Jacob would be at his weakest, his guard down. That moment came on November 10th, 2009, when Jacob came downstairs, drunk and unsteady. As he fumbled with the food tray, Sam acted. She lunged at him, driving the shard of metal into his arm. Jacob let out a roar of pain, but before he could retaliate, the others joined in. Emily grabbed the heavy tray and slammed it against his head, while Ava shielded the baby, her body coiled like a spring. Rachel found a piece of wood and struck Jacob repeatedly, her years of suppressed fear and anger exploding into violence. Jacob fell to the ground, blood pooling beneath him as his eyes rolled back. The women didn't wait to see if he was unconscious or dead. They ripped the keys from his pocket, unlocked their chains, and bolted up the stairs. The cold night air hit their faces like a shock, but they didn't stop. Barefoot and half naked, they ran through the darkness, their breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the road. A truck approached, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, stopped immediately when he saw them. The sight of the women, bloodied, trembling, and carrying a newborn, was enough to make him act without question. He called the police, his hands shaking as he held his phone. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights cutting through the dark and illuminating the women's battered and bruised faces. The victims were immediately transported to the hospital, where medical staff treated their injuries, bruises, lacerations, and signs of prolonged physical abuse. Doctors also examined the infant, checking for any signs of distress or harm. Meanwhile, law enforcement descended on Jacob's property, unaware of the horrors that awaited them inside. The basement was a scene out of a nightmare, a true chamber of horrors. Chains bolted to the walls, a blood-stained mattress in the corner, and a bucket overflowing with filth painted a vivid and sickening picture of the abuse that had taken place there. Investigators meticulously documented the scene, each piece of evidence more disturbing than the last. Upstairs, they discovered a trove of incriminating materials: journals filled with Jacob's meticulous and twisted plans, photographs cataloging the abuse he inflicted, and a manifesto detailing his disturbing vision of a pure lineage. The investigation quickly revealed that Jacob wasn't acting alone. He was a key figure in the Iron Dawn Alliance, a neo-Nazi group with ties to domestic terrorism. While many members of the group claimed ignorance of Jacob's specific crimes, evidence pointed to their complicity in supporting his efforts. An anonymous tip, later traced back to a disillusioned former member, was the breakthrough law enforcement needed. It not only exposed the depth of Jacob's depravity, but also unraveled a vast network of extremists. Raids across multiple states resulted in numerous arrests, and the Iron Dawn Alliance was dismantled piece by piece. The discovery of the basement and its horrors shocked even the most seasoned investigators, but it also marked the beginning of justice for Jacob's victims and a critical blow to a dangerous hate group operating in the shadows. In 2012, Jacob R. Miller stood trial for a series of horrific crimes that shocked the small community where he lived. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and advocates, all eager to see justice served. Sam and Ava, two of Jacob's victims, bravely took the stand, recounting in graphic detail the abuse and terror they endured. Their testimonies were gut-wrenching, painting a clear picture of the psychological and physical torment inflicted upon them. Photos and evidence recovered from Jacob's basement, including the discovery of Lily's lifeless body, solidified the gravity of his actions. The defense argued that Jacob suffered from severe mental illness and lacked the capacity to fully comprehend his actions. However, the prosecution presented a damning case, including meticulous records Jacob kept of his crimes, which showed clear intent and premeditation. Over the course of several weeks, jurors were exposed to the depths of Jacob's depravity, and the emotional weight of the case was evident in their expressions. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict, Jacob was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The smirk he had worn during much of the trial disappeared, as he faced the reality of spending the rest of his life behind bars. For the survivors, the verdict was a step toward healing, but their fight wasn't over. In the years that followed, Sam and Ava became outspoken advocates against human trafficking and domestic terrorism, using their own experiences to raise awareness and demand stronger protections for victims. Rachel, who had escaped Jacob's influence and assisted in exposing his crimes, used her knowledge of extremist groups to collaborate with law enforcement, aiding in the takedown of similar criminal networks. In Lily's honor, the survivors established the Lily Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing resources and support to individuals recovering from captivity and abuse. The foundation also funds educational programs aimed at preventing such crimes and ensuring that victims have access to the help they need. While the scars of Jacob's actions will remain with the survivors for life, their resilience and determination have turned tragedy into a mission for justice and change. Lily's memory lives on as a symbol of their strength and a reminder of the importance of fighting against the darkness that allows such crimes to occur. If you're captivated by cases like this, be sure to subscribe for more true crime stories. Next, check out the chilling account of a woman who targeted and killed 3 cheating men across Texas. Share your thoughts below. We want to hear your take.